Mollie Johnson. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor in the Zero Emission HGVs team at the Department for Transport, and I'm joined here today by my colleague Tom Froggatt. I'll pass over to him now to give a rundown on the UK's road transport decarbonisation commitments and the issues that the road freight sector are facing.
Thanks very much, Mollie. So we'll try to keep this as brief as we can, because I'm aware that lunch isn't too far around the corner. So to sort of start with, give a bit of a sort of big picture on where we're at. So as you can see in these graphs, so in 2020, 24% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions were from transport. Since 1990, sort of other sectors have reduced their emissions dramatically, with total domestic emissions dropping by 44%, I think, to 2019. But critically, transport was down only by 5%. So in June 2019, as you will all be well aware, the UK legislated for net zero greenhouse gas emissions across the entire economy by 2050, in addition to those 5 yearly carbon budgets, which set caps on emissions. That moved on? Oh, right. Yes, it has. So in 2021, we also set out plans specifically for transport via the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, or TDP for short, as well as the net zero strategy. The TDP was published in summertime 2021 and is essentially our green print to decarbonise all modes of transport by 2050, ranging from our seas and skies to our roads and our railways. We've since published a one-year-on document which shared the progress made from implementing many of the TDP's ambitious commitments. Some of these included new funding for sustainable aviation fuels, the creation of new skilled jobs at ports, all across the UK with the creation of UK Shore. Crucially for this audience, it also included the launch of the world's largest demonstration programme of zero-emission HGVs. More on that to come, don't worry. And also great strides in our aim to make public transport and walking and cycling the natural first choice for journeys. So in terms of the net zero strategy, this was published later in October 2021 and is a delivery plan for meeting carbon budget 6. Beyond 2027, it also sets out the policies and pathways to fully decarbonise the UK economy by 2050. So lots of numbers there. So as you can see on this slide, reducing emissions obviously does so much more than just decarbonise transport. It can deliver critical co-benefits in terms of healthier and greener streets, and as well as improving air quality in our towns and cities. The future low-carbon transport economy also offers significant potential for economic growth, job creation, and the opportunities for the UK to become a global leader. So the issues facing road freight more generally. Just zooming into that, obviously, given that's obviously why we're here today, as you can see on these infographics, in the 12 months to June 2022, 1.65 billion tonnes of goods were lifted by GB-registered HGVs operating in the UK. Obviously, I know that I'm preaching to the choir. We all know from previous speakers already about the importance of HGVs, but this is obviously a huge number. To the right, you can see how this compares to other modal domestic freight transport. We know also that HGVs move the vast majority of freight, as has already been touched upon. The most common type of haul lifted by GB vehicles for the 12 months to the end of June 2022 was groupage, accounting for 21% of goods by weight. For those that don't know, this is where vehicles obviously carry a mixture of different commodities, but I'm sure everybody obviously is aware of that. The most common single category of commodity lifted was mining products at 15%, food products at 14% as well. And the top 5 commodities lifted accounted for 70% of all goods lifted by GB-registered HGVs in the UK. So ultimately, what is the emissions problem? As you can see, in 2021, HGV is responsible for over a fifth of domestic greenhouse gas road transport emissions at 21%. That's only second only to cars and taxis at 57%. Crucially also, they were also responsible for 8% of nitrogen oxide and 16% of PM10 air quality pollutants arising from domestic transport as well. We know that the demand for HGVs is projected to grow, and with that growth, the emissions from road freight could make up to 20% of UK GHG emissions by 2050 without decarbonisation, around from 5% a few years ago, so that's a massive jump. Whilst at an early stage of development than light vans, zero-emission HGVs are appearing on the market, particularly in those low-weight categories, especially below 26 tonnes, where battery electric technology is beginning to dominate. But of course, we're also aware that the technical pathway to decarbonise those longer-haul articulated HGVs is less certain due to the multiple technology options on offer. I'm going to speed up a bit because I'm aware of time. So onto the good stuff, at least we'd like to think so, but obviously aware of the challenges that remain. So just our demonstrator programme that I touched upon earlier. So this is better known as ZERFed. Ultimately, we remain in government technology neutral, which means that we see opportunities for both hydrogen fuel cell and battery electric HGVs, and we are using the ZERFed programme to demonstrate zero-emission HGV technology at scale on UK roads. This programme will inform which technology or which mix of technologies is best suited for use in the UK. Currently, as it stands, unless someone tells me otherwise, this is the world's largest current comparative demonstration of zero-emission trucks, and will help us collect a strong evidence base to inform strategic and long-term infrastructure decisions. Obviously, we won't go into detail on the objectives, as you can see those behind me, but very quickly, our ZERFed aims primarily are to create a strong evidence base, obviously grow confidence to encourage long-term investment in zero-emission technology and infrastructure, provide an understanding of infrastructure needs and of what the barriers are to deploying that infrastructure, support the transition to a fully zero-emission fleet of HGVs in the UK, and crucially also identify potential standards and regulation which may present barriers.
Thank you. That was very smooth handover. I am going to touch a little bit on what we've achieved so far. There we go. So since the publication of the TDP, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, in July 2021, we've already come a long way. So I'll start with the obvious one, which is behind me on the screen. At COP26, we announced the UK's phase-out dates for new non-zero emission HGVs. So as the infographic shows, these are 2035 for our smaller HGVs, which are less than or equal to 26 tonnes, and 2040 for all HGVs regardless of weight. This puts the UK on course to be the fastest G7 country to decarbonise HGVs. The introduction of phase-out dates obviously helped the government to deliver its emissions targets, but they are also crucial to drive innovation in the zero-emission market, while also helping to improve air quality in our towns and cities and supporting economic growth. To follow on from those phase-out dates, we issued a call for evidence on exemptions to the 2035 phase-out date in July 2022. So this is for those vehicles that may take a little bit longer to transition, and was in recognition of the complexity of HGVs and HGV use cases. As the slide shows, these vehicles might include those used for energy-intensive applications or other parts of the market that may take longer to transition, such as niche or small volume manufacturers. I'm sorry, I just hit my mic. The call for evidence closed last year, and a formal response will be published in due course in true government speak. So all the while, we are doing a lot of work to help reduce emissions from the existing fleet. So we have our freight portal, which is a free-to-access website that promotes advice to freight operators on fuel consumption and emissions reductions. It includes case studies and advice on policy regulation, as well as a fuel cost-cutting calculator. So again, this is free to access and gets updated regularly, so a really good resource. We have also made some changes to the zero emission and alternatively fueled vehicle weight increases, which just rolls off the tongue. Under current regulations, the heavier powertrain required on zero emission and alternatively fueled vehicles acts as a payload penalty, which reduces the amount of cargo a vehicle can carry. The department is intending to implement weight limit increases, which will remove this payload penalty and make them more commercially attractive. The draft regulations were published in January this year. And finally, we have got the auxiliary engine research project. So of course, auxiliary engines on HGVs, that photo's come up as well. Auxiliary engines on HGVs can be a significant source of emissions, and the department has therefore launched a research project with Zemo in September 2022 to determine the emissions from those auxiliary engines and to look at how we can come up with low and zero emission alternatives. So very conscious of time, so I'm gonna try and be a bit quick now. I'm now gonna talk a bit about the international landscape. Obviously, the UK's supply chains are closely integrated with our neighbouring European countries. Indeed, the UK is the third largest net importer of food in the world. 28% of all UK food is imported from the EU and 18% from the rest of the world. So it's really important that we keep an eye to the international landscape. Obviously, many UK operators travel abroad and many EU operators travel to the UK. So we're keen to ensure that the transition to net zero is as smooth as possible for everyone involved. To ensure that ambition remains high across the world and amongst our international partners, the UK are signatories to the Global Memorandum of Understanding on Zero-Emission Medium and Heavy-Duty Vehicles, or MHDVs for short, and Alan touched on this a little bit earlier. This brings together leading countries and commits us to work together to ensure all new sales of MHDVs are zero-emission by 2040, with a 30% sales target by 2035. The MOU has been endorsed by governments, subnational governments, manufacturers, suppliers, fleet owners and operators, investors, and financial institutions. So lots of buy-in for this. The EU are close allies to the UK due to the EU's geographical proximity, our intertwined markets, and our supply chains. And we will continue to engage with them to share knowledge and best practice on developments in tech, infrastructure, and regulations. There's also the role of alternative fuels. So I'm going to briefly touch on this now. Low carbon fuels, also often shortened to LCFs, are important for our HGV phase-out dates as they have fewer pollutants than conventional fuels. This means they're less polluting, with LCFs currently providing a third of greenhouse gas savings in the transport sector. As Tom touched on earlier, in 2020, HGVs were responsible for 8% of nitrogen oxides and 16% of particulate matter air quality pollutants arising from domestic transport. So we see LCFs as playing a really important role in reducing road freight emissions, especially in those larger HGVs. The closer we get to a net zero road freight sector, the less the LCFs will be relied upon for use in HGVs, especially as zero emission tech becomes more commercially viable for all HGV use cases and drive cycles. This is all very topical, given the department will be publishing a low-carbon fuel strategy in spring 2023, which will set out the role of LCFs for all transport types, not just HGVs. So what is government already doing to help? And sorry, I am running over, I think. Of course, we know that the transition to zero emission isn't going to happen overnight. We're therefore providing support in different ways to help industry transition. Some of these will initially help the transition to low carbon fuels, while others focus on the end goal of zero emission. So I'll start with ZERFT, obviously, the Zero Emission Road Freight Demonstrator Programme. Tom's already kind of covered this, so I won't go into too much detail, but this is the department's R&D programme, which aims to test out the different technologies available for zero-emission HGVs on UK roads. So this will help us understand which technologies work, as well as the associated infrastructure required for them. We've also got the plug-in van and truck grants. So the government has provided £582 million to continue our plug-in grants until 2024-2025, including the plug-in truck grant. So this reduces the purchase price of zero-emission commercial vehicles, with grant rates for eligible trucks being set at 20% of the purchase price, with up to £25,000 of funding available for the largest HGVs. We've also got our renewable transport fuel obligation, which I'm sure most of you are already aware of because it's been kicking about since about 2008. The RTFO is a certificate trading scheme which supports our policy on decarbonising transport by encouraging the production and use of renewable fuels that don't damage the environment. Really quickly, we've also got the local authority toolkits. These provide local authorities with guidance and advice on how to identify, plan, and deliver sustainable transport measures that can help to reduce carbon emissions. These are regularly updated with up-to-date information as government policy develops. We've also got the freight portal, which I'm not going to linger on because I've already gone over that. And we also announced earlier this year, if that's come up. No, it's gone up in the wrong order, so I'll do it this way. We announced earlier this year the £7 million Freight Innovation Fund, which aims to support SMEs with solutions to current challenges in the UK freight sector. The fund will identify and trial new products and services coming to market in the freight sector, convening and supporting innovative organisations. Lastly, for hydrogen specifically, we've got the UK's first hydrogen transport hub, which has now been established in the Tees Valley. This brings together government, industry and academia to explore the use of hydrogen across the entire transport system. Last slide now, I promise. Looking ahead, we understand that one of the biggest challenges to switching to zero emission is the associated recharging and refueling infrastructure, and we've listened to what everyone has said in responses to our consultations and call for evidences. We're working to outline the associated infrastructure needs and energy requirements for a zero-emission road freight sector. This will, of course, be informed by ZERFT and the outputs from that, but we will also be working closely with industry to identify the biggest barriers to infrastructure rollout, and we'll look to outline how we will collectively resolve them. Looking even further ahead, while our phase-out dates were the first step in the process, end-of-sale dates will also need to be supported by a framework that enforces these dates. So consultation on what this future regulation might look like and how it may impact the sector will take place, you guessed it, in due course. So thanks, everyone. Really sorry for, I assume, going over my time, and looking forward to a really interesting panel discussion on such an important topic.
Thank you very much, Mollie. And Tom? Right, we'll introduce the rest of the remaining members of our panel. So I'll ask you, in fact, I'm going to ask you to do it yourselves, starting with you, Graham.
Hi, yeah, Graham Thomas from Ocado, operating. We're driving forward with compressed natural gas from a truck point of view. We're looking at all sorts of options around how we manage refrigeration, and that's something we'll talk about shortly. And then from a home delivery point of view, we're using the Category B licence derogation at 4.25 tonne to run EVs, but progress is hindered by lack of vehicle availability in that weight category currently.
Yeah, and obviously derogation is very important in that space.
Absolutely, which is another thing that we need to hear from government in due course. So
in due course is a good phrase. Graham, obviously, you know, those of you that know Graham, around lots of people in the room will know Graham, and will know that Ocado has been at the forefront of trying to find decarbonisation and carbon emission reductions, the technology for transport, probably first and longest in the space. Harsh.
Thank you very much, Shane. Harsh Persad, I work for Tevva Motors. Tevva is a UK manufacturer of zero-emission trucks, battery trucks, and hydrogen electric trucks. If you have time when you go outside, please do look around at our hydrogen truck, which is at the entrance to the building. My role at Tevva is to support customers develop the energy solution for them, so whether that's electric charging or hydrogen refueling, trying to make the transition from diesel as convenient, affordable and sustainable as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh. And James?
Thank you, Shane. James Bielby from the Federation of Wholesale Distributors. We represent the distribution of food and drink to retailers and caterers. Obviously, our members have a big fleet, and they're doing their best to decarbonise and make the transition. I've worked closely with Shane for many years, since he was a lad in short trousers. But this is the first time we've come together to talk about cold chain and climate issues. But it's something that our members are obviously at the forefront of, to the extent that they're able to. And similar challenges to Graham from Ocado, you know, the infrastructure requirements and some of the things that are needed to be put in place in order to make that transition. I imagine that's what we're going to unpack a little bit in the next 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, thank you very much. So let's start with technology suite of availability. And like I said, we're going to focus in on refrigeration on vehicles and the issue around auxiliary engines. Actually, on that, very specifically, Mollie, in your presentation, you referred to the auxiliary engine study. What's the sort of time frame for that study, and what's the sort of direction that might take in terms of government policy or government thinking about that specific area? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay.
But I can put you in touch with the team that is responsible for the project.
I think one thing to bear in mind on that is that whenever we talk about vehicle transport regulation, very rarely does that cover the regulation of the fridge on the vehicle. So the engine has different production standards, it has different emission requirements, it has different interaction with things like low environment zones. And so basically it's important to understand that that's a different track of policy in that specific area, which has a very significant impact for us and very much a focus for us in Cold Chain Federation. So then moving on to you then, Graham, can I ask you to sort of talk, like I said, you have a very long experience of trialling and trying to find ways to decarbonise your fleet. What's your view of the market right now in terms of options? How optimistic does it make you about the future?
Looking at refrigeration in isolation, I'm really optimistic. There's been stuff around for a long time with Frigoblock, with ecogen systems, with PTO drives from trucks. All of that stuff's been around for a long time. The take-up has been hindered by red diesel subsidy. So nobody's been forced into doing it, really. But of course, the growing groundswell means that actually there are disruptors coming to the market with the likes of Sunswap in particular, who are doing some great stuff. And obviously the removal of that subsidy has accelerated that exponentially. And actually the viability is becoming more, which is what most operators will look at ultimately. So there's absolutely there's a wide range and a growing range of options available, without a shadow of a doubt.
And how much do you sort of pull out the refrigeration challenge from the wider challenge in terms of how you think about it from a strategic point of view?
There's more focus on that now than there ever has been because of that cost element, and because of, we've been doing some great stuff. Like I say, we've been running compressed natural gas since 2018 now. But, it's great having this nice clean bit at the front. The bit at the back that's keeping the food cold is in some cases no better than Euro 3, 4. So, there really is that step change to move it. And we've been sort of plugging away, and we're looking to see what's coming to market. And some of it fits, some of it doesn't fit. There's the infrastructure comes up. A lot of operators in legacy depots, if you like, won't have standby points. So, and won't have the shore power to be able to plug in, and putting that in retrospectively again is expensive. So there's a bit around developers to making sure that the new build sites for that has got that there in the first place. Because ultimately, if you're preloading, just stood in the yard, you don't want to be running that on diesel if you can afford it, because particularly in the current climate. So
and you've just gone live, or you've just taken delivery, and you're out on the road now with Sunswap, with
Sunswap's not live yet. We're still working with those guys, but we've just gone live with Titan, which is through Marshall Fleet Solutions.
Gotcha.
So we put that's right.
Lionel's going to be after me in the break.
Yeah,
sorry.
Lionel's there
of course,
somewhere.
it's the Titan.
So we in our operation in particular, we believe that can absolutely eradicate the diesel usage. It's on that particular trailer, it's a first at double deck. I had to swallow a bit of a brave pill because this thing's 4.98 metres tall. The lowest motorway bridge in the UK is 5 metres. So there's not a lot of wriggle room. But that's a single temp operation. So we believe that over the course of this trial period now, that we'll be able to actually eliminate diesel from that operation on that trailer. So the trial will prove it, hopefully, and that's a real bolt-on option that we'll be able to retrofit in a lot of cases, which could actually make us meet that market, that target much quicker.
It really struck me that when you've said in previous times we've spoken about this, that you think that solution will mean you don't use diesel in your fridges on those trucks.
Yeah, absolutely, and that won't be the case. It's operation dependent. If you're running multi-temperature regimes within there, then you find that you need a little bit of diesel just to top it up as the batteries get down to sort of 20%. But it's great to be able to get this new technology that's emerging now and really put it to the test and understand what it's doing.
Thank you. James, can I ask you, obviously we've been through the last 3 years of crisis in terms of COVID and Brexit, and particularly the wholesale sector has had it's been firefighting, shall we say, to get through the period. How do you think that's affected mentality and attitude towards new technology and trying new technologies and adoption? Where do you think we're at now as a result of those contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of framing it, because as you say, it has been particularly challenging 3 years, almost to the day, although we can go back to the planning for Brexit, which was something which animated our sector for a long time in 2019, certainly around no deal planning. And I think it has meant that the focus has been on the day-to-day. I mean, we as a wholesale sector have got some ambitious net zero targets. We want to be like the rest of the food and drink industry, be net zero by 2040. But lots of members are well positioned to do that, and they're taking steps. So some of our bigger members, the likes of Bid Food and Breaks and Booker, are doing a lot. Lots of the smaller members are not, because they haven't had the bandwidth to be able to think about it. So as we come out of that particularly trying period, although obviously there's still day-to-day challenges, I think, you know, making that investment and thinking about the need to invest and move forward in that way is something that they're starting to think about. But I think the challenge, it remains that when we're talking about a sort of zero emission infrastructure, they don't necessarily have the support to be able to do that from government. And obviously I've got Mollie here from DFT. Don't want to be too hard on our friends and colleagues in government, but you know, things like tax breaks and scrappage schemes and grants. You know, we talk here about the plug-in grant. It's 25k maximum. That's going to skim the surface. Obviously welcome, and it's not government's role to give free money to business. Totally understand that, but you know, there is perhaps the conversation hasn't taken place yet to the extent that it needs to. I know that's beginning to happen and has happened, but I was struck by what you said a moment ago, Shane, about when the discussion has been taking place, it has been around engine as opposed to the refrigerated element of that truck. A good example of that would be the red diesel ban of a couple of years ago. You, I, and others in the industry were very keen for some form of help, delay, support for the red diesel which was used in the refrigeration element of those trucks. That didn't happen. You know, probably understandable why, but it had never really been thought about to the extent that it needed to be, because the refrigeration part is seen as secondary, and I think a lot of the focus has been on the actual vehicle and the engines rather than the multi-temp aspect that our members and your members use in their operations.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good summary of all those different issues. I'm going to come back to you in a moment. I'm going to talk about city and urban regulation and how that impacts on behaviour, particularly for wholesale and last mile delivery. But I want to bring in Harsh to talk about hydrogen, specifically about infrastructure. So obviously, you know, there's a discussion ongoing about, you know, the pros and cons of different alternative fuels. But can you sort of explain why Tevva has made the investment it has, and where you think that hydrogen fits into the mix in terms of this decarbonisation journey for HGVs?
Thank you, Shane. So Tevva started as a battery truck company, but as we heard in the case of Lineage earlier, so far the battery technologies aren't able to meet all the needs of a lot of fleet operators here. And so we and others have looked to other alternative energy solutions. And the one that we found most promising is a combination of battery technology with hydrogen fuel cell technology. So we're still selling battery trucks, and we'll continue to develop those across different product ranges. But with our hydrogen truck, for example, the truck that's out front here, we can get about 60% more ton miles with the use of hydrogen fuel cells to complement the battery technology that's on board. And that means effectively that truck that you saw at the entrance, we were able to do a run of that truck of about 350 miles in the cold weather when it was snowing everywhere just before Christmas. And we haven't yet been able to mimic that yet in our battery trucks. Of course, battery technology is improving rapidly, the costs are getting better, fast charging is getting better. But today, in order to get the benefits of fast refueling and fairly lightweight, then the hydrogen technology seems to be the most competitive. And our approach is actually that try to mix and match and get we use a dual energy system, try to get the best, most efficient solution for whatever journeys people have.
And obviously I know, Harsh, your particular expertise and what you bring to the collective wisdom, not just for Tevva but for us all, is about hydrogen infrastructure. So what reassurance can you give people in this room that there is a way to achieve the sorts of infrastructure you need to run a hydrogen fleet or a hydrogen fuel extended fleet in the near term?
Thanks, Shane. So I think so it's certainly easier actually to imagine what the medium and longer visions for this sector could be. Certainly, when we get into the 2030s, in multiple countries around the world, we should have public hydrogen refueling stations and depot-based hydrogen refueling pretty ubiquitous. And as we get closer to 2050, we'll actually see a wind down of all the diesel infrastructure that there is and replacement with both hydrogen and electric charging. The next 10 years are crucial, partly for carbon emissions, but also for our industrial base. If we wait, we'll end up importing those solutions from elsewhere. If we act now, we can really grow our contribution and export that worldwide. What we're able to see in the short term is supporting the development of new public stations by working perhaps with other OEMs, but certainly with end users, to make sure that we cluster low carbon trucking in locations to bring down the cost of infrastructure, to make it easier to access hydrogen. So that's one opportunity. And another is to support the development of new technologies like mobile hydrogen refueling, which allows you to get hydrogen to depots. There's a bigger ecosystem that we're also looking to develop, which is the service and maintenance infrastructure, which it will be needed. We're fortunate to be able to learn from the bus industry, industries like CNG and LNG, on how to make that transition for those partners as safe as possible. But it does require a level of coordination in the industry. It does certainly require a level of investment. The countries that seem to be leading so far are the ones where they've got this partnership approach between end users, manufacturers, energy players, and government. So if we can replicate that in the UK, we can certainly get to potentially of the order of 100 stations, 100 refueling stations by the end of the 2020s. And a mix of those will be some at depots, some at strategic locations on the road network and ports. And it's much smaller than we have already been successful with our gas industries and all of our other energy infrastructure. So I
think it's one of the things to always bear in mind is that we talk about these things not being too big and not achievable, but then you think about the things that we just take for granted now that had to be built at some point: the electricity infrastructure, the gas infrastructure, the sewage infrastructure, all these things that we didn't have at one point and they were built over a period of time that's more quick than you think. Please, anyone got any questions, please put your hand up. And Joanne.
Hi, I'm Joanne from the P&M Group. With the electric technology for whether it's cars or HGVs, obviously in terms of driving that vehicle along the road, it is zero emissions as long as it's charged with green energies. What's being done to address the emissions of actually creating the battery? Like, I know there's a lot of problems with the mining of the metals and the social and the carbon problems with that. So do you have any information on what's being done to sort of mitigate those?
Harsh, you're probably closest to that one, even though you're hydrogen, but go on, have a go at battery,
okay.
Go on.
I'll speak in, first of all, just to context it, the amount of mining required for lithium and copper for wires is, it's of the order of a hundredth or less of the industry for diesel, in terms of, say, numbers of wells or number of fields. So the scale of mining is so much smaller than the scale of oil and gas production today. So I think that's, and it will stay, it will grow, but it won't grow to the levels that oil and gas have been today, are today. Okay, so that's kind of one point. In terms of the sustainability of the actual raw materials in there, so we were worried, I think 10 years ago, that there's lithium shortages and other rare earth shortages. A lot of new investment has gone in, and the supply of lithium itself is, now people are exploring all over the world for it. They're discovering it in more and more places. So the potential shortage relative to demand is receding. I think there was a genuine concern that we would run out. At the moment, I think the concern is more geopolitical. Where is it? Who's grabbed it already? And what happens around that? There are specific elements like cobalt, which have been particularly worrisome for some people. We use lithium iron phosphate technology, which is much more readily available, much more sustainable, rather than using more precious metals. And I think that transition to using more benign, more readily available metal technologies is also progressing at pace. There are still problems in those supply chains. They have to comply with a lot of ESG basics, frankly, I think, to become more sustainable. Very few people who are invested in those aren't doing it without environmental context, though. So I'm optimistic that will happen, but it requires continual push. It requires continual reporting and making sure that we track all that over time as well.
Can I just ask, I'm conscious that we're against time, but Graham and James in particular, one thing that we observe very closely in terms of like immediate regulatory pressure is around urban movement restrictions, whether it's London, whether it's Manchester, and some of the smaller cities as well. How much is that the driver of some of the technology adoption that you've been taking on in the Ocado home delivery fleet, for example, and then for you, James, on the wholesale side?
Yeah, certainly that was a factor in terms of transition Euro 5, Euro 6 and the clean air zones. We have a challenge at the minute where we're watching lots of local authorities doing their own thing, and there's no national standard, which kind of should be Euro 6 at this stage, with a view to moving to zero emission. So we've got little zero emission pockets dropping up in different places, which become challenging to manage. Yeah, arguably, and it's going to be, we'll achieve a battery electric 4x2 tractor with decent range before we achieve a battery electric 3.5 ton, 4.25 ton van that can do everything that everybody wants it to do. We've got some sites where we've got 300, 3.5 tonners that do 180 miles twice a day, that I can't see as achieving that with a battery electric in 5 years. So hydrogen fuel cell, I think, for some of those applications will be the right solution. So we then have to think very carefully about where we place those limited number of zero emission 3.5 tonners. So that's definitely an impact for us.
Yeah. And James?
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the sort of the technology on things like the battery electric isn't where it needs to be. Although for our members, lots of that last mile work is done in smaller vehicles, obviously much more advanced than HGV. But I mean, if Graham says around that sort of patchwork of different regulations in different local authorities, yeah, it's not coordinated. But I think eventually what will happen is it will all join up. So eventually there'll be no areas that aren't regulated. Yeah. So it will happen by default, if you like, at different paces. Obviously London much further advanced, Manchester possibly second, and some Birmingham, Sheffield. But eventually it will join up, I think.
I mean, we have a job to do as representative bodies to make the points about this fragmentation of people moving faster than others and some of the implications of that in the short term. But the overarching message to take from all of that is this isn't going to go slower. This isn't going to stop or go back the other way. So basically take what's the more extreme versions and accept that's going to happen in the end and work on that basis in terms of how you're planning for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I said, at the outset, funding that transition is really important. Businesses can do a certain extent, but if it's been imposed on them through regulation, wherever that might be in the country, then, some help in terms of tax breaks. I mean, we've got the budget today. We may see some help there. And, with regard to investment being offset against tax, all those things that need to happen. Is absolutely every person in this room wants to be on that journey, but it's not possible to do it without investment in tech and infrastructure. We can do some of that, but government has a role as well.
Great. Thank you, James. Right, so we're up against lunch now, but Mollie, can I ask you to say a few words in closing about what you're looking for from the industry generally to help with the policy development from a DFT point of view?
Thank you. And I think really it's really important to just keep having these conversations, being able to come along and hear from you guys about your experiences. We are here to help, even though that's not always how we come across. And I know that these targets are seen as ambitious by many, but I really do think that they are feasible and I think they can be done. We've got models starting to come to market. We're still kind of 12 to 17 years off these phase-out dates. We're going to continue to invest in the R&D to give you certainty, and we haven't really touched on it today, but I do think that for those kind of smaller companies, the second-hand market is also going to play a really important role in getting to those phase-out dates. So yeah, just keep having those conversations, keep coming to us and telling us what your experiences are and what you think, and we'll continue to listen.
Thank you very much, Mollie. Thank you very much for coming today as well. So can we thank our panel for the session?